I want to give a special shout out here to Ramsey Pryor. He is a good gent, knows a lot, and he led international expansion at Branch. And I have talked to him about this, and he's very humble and self-effacing, but I know folks who watched him along his journey, and they were stunned at how quickly and competently Branch moved across markets. They scaled and did some amazing things. He's on sabbatical at the moment, and he is joining us today, and this was his idea to do this panel, and he reached out to his friends over at Reddit and Frontline Ventures and Zoom to make sure that we had the best advice that anyone can find. So thank you, Ramsey. I want to also introduce Stephen. This idea, part of the idea that Ramsey and I were vibing out on was an article that he published recently in the Harvard Business Review. It was a great article, and I encourage you to track it down. Can't remember the title, but Stephen may remind us in just a moment here. But he was critical to Twitter's expansion into Europe, and was also part of the expansion of Google into Europe, in particular, Dublin. Now, then, so he's at Frontline Ventures now, and he helps a lot of companies as they're expanding, with giving some of the benefit of his insight and advice and experience. We have Tariq Mahmoud from Reddit. He is the head of international expansion there, and Reddit runs into all kinds of interesting issues around the world. And I think a very interesting one is how they make money. So we'll get into that. And then, of course, Zoom, we have Abe Smith. What a year it's been for Zoom. So I'm sure that we're going to get into some very interesting conversation around what this has meant for you and where it's all going. So, so I guess the first thing that I would want to ask is that, you know, what's the right time to go global when you're a company? Like if you're a high growth company, you've done well in the United States, maybe, you know, you're getting signals from a bunch of other markets, but, you know, you're not really sure what to do yet, or you're not sure that it's the right time. How do you determine that it's the right time? And Stephen, I'll lead with you, because I know that you counsel a lot of companies that have made the commitment to do that. Stephen, what's the right time?
Yeah, we look back at how about 200 B2B software companies have expanded internationally over the last 10 years. So we have some sort of data on when they tend to expand. And then also I'll give you just my personal opinion, because they don't always get it right. So typically around Series C is the most common stage. You see some before that and some after, but that's the most common sort of spike in expansions. To get a little bit more detailed, what I think is the right time, a few criteria have to be kind of met. One is your go-to-market has to be repeatable without heroics in the home market in the US. So that usually rules out most Series A companies. Two, I would say you have to be adequately funded, which again rules out most Series A companies, because an expansion internationally usually costs a few $1 million before you start getting a serious return on revenue. And you're just not going to be able to do it on even a good Series A, a 10 million Series A. You're not going to be able to do it properly. And then 3 and 4, I think it's good to have some evidence of international demand so that it's not all push. There's a little bit of pull. And then that final criterion for me is more a softer one related to the CEO and the executive team. I think it's really helpful if the CEO makes it a personal priority for himself or herself, and has the executive team's buy-in on the expansion, because international expansion is such a cross-functional effort.
How would you answer that, Ramsey?
Very aligned with Stephen. In fact, Stephen, I met when Branch was at the beginning of our international expansion. So he gave me a lot of the same advice. We were Series C before we really took it seriously. And what I would add to what Stephen said about having the right funding, having a good sense of your unit economics, which may be similar to what Stephen, you were saying about, you know, making sure your go-to-market has worked out. You know, the things I would add here is you need to do the groundwork. So you need to have a plan. You need to look at your addressable market. And I would recommend not looking so much in an absolute sense, but looking in a relative sense. If you know the size or the trajectory of your home market, at least knowing a relative sizing of the market that you plan to enter. And if it's larger, are you really ready to go into a larger market? If it's smaller, how much smaller? And there's a lot of groundwork that you should be doing from an adjacent market, really to understand what the competitive environment looks like, what the labor situation looks like. There's quite a few lessons learned there of, what does it actually mean to put employees on the ground in a certain location? There's things that you can do before you actually make your first hires and should do. The last thing I would add is, for some companies, the international expansion can feel like a bit of an experiment. But an employee, someone that you hire, never wants to feel that way. They don't want to feel like they are an experiment. You need to be ready to have global employees. And there's a lot that goes with that, whether it's how you operate, when meetings happen, how you communicate via asynchronous tools like Zoom or Slack. All of those things need to be really thought through before you go in.
What do you say, Abe? By the way, Abe, I forgot to mention or ask this, but were you part of the initial decision? Like, where did you come into the Zoom dynamic, and at what stage did they decide to bring you in, and what did you see when you went in, and what's happened since then? I'm curious about that. And do you feel like it was the right time?
It definitely was for us. I mean, I fully agree with what Ramsey and Steven said, 100%. And I've been in early stage companies, Series A and Series B, and we were definitely not in at the right time. And I think in some cases premature, to be perfectly honest with you. At Zoom, it was very deliberate for us. I came in as head of international, and I was really fortunate to have taken over for a person that I'd worked with before who did an amazing job. I mean, the company already had about 20% of revenue outside the United States. We were very well funded at that point. Both Sequoia and Emergence had backed the company, and we were readying for public offering. It was right before S1, so we knew that international was going to be critical, and the nature of the product lent itself. As a global communications provider, whether it was for the local markets nationally to use it, or multinationals that were going to demand that we could support and serve them around the world, we knew it was coming. And frankly, for us to continue to have the right kind of buoyancy and growth, Eric Yuan, our founder, as Steven mentioned, was very internationally focused. He knew that was going to be a critical element for us. So, we had people on the ground in the UK, and we had people physically on the ground in Australia and Sydney. There were little pockets elsewhere, but that was the majority. And you could almost say it's Silicon Valley International Light. And we were lucky to have some internationalpreneurs who wanted to go start and grow these businesses, and they did it well, and they were nationally hired. I think for us, at the point where I came on, we knew we were going to start to trigger rapid expansion, and that the contribution expectations were going to grow rapidly. We didn't expect a global pandemic, but fortunately, we were in a position to have some core team in place. I think, or as the demand found Zoom, so to speak, we probably would have been underserving the market and unable to address some of the opportunity that was organically there.
How about you, Tariq?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that's been said. I don't want to repeat anything, but the only three things I'll add is you really got to get your home office in order, and that's around operations, processes, product. You don't want to be in a position where you're trying to invent a brand new thing that is global in nature, right? You really want to be in a position where you're trying to export things or invent things that are specific to international. The second thing I want to mention is, and I think Ramsey alluded to this, is you have to be culturally either 100% committed or not at all. And if you're not at all, then don't do it yet. But you can't be in this wishy-washy 50% experiment phase, because employees hate it, and you're never going to try to achieve the strategic importance of it given the ROI. And then the third thing is, to sort of reverse a question, a really bad time is right after an IPO, because either capital markets will either love you or hate you, but they won't be indifferent to you because of the low and negative short-term ROI that international typically takes. So sort of around Series C, we started Series D, but not right after an IPO, unless you're ready to bear the brunt of it.
So in your experience, I mean, what's the best organizational design that you've seen work? Like how should executives that have made the decision start to think about principal agent problems or miscommunication issues, or the strains of working across that many continents? So I guess in terms of headquarters, how should, what have you seen really work well and what does not? Stephen?
Tariq kind of touched on this, but I think it's generally a good practice to have had a second office in the US before you try opening an office several time zones away. So, you start off in the Bay Area, maybe you have a New York East Coast office. That at least breaks the back of some of the common teething problems that companies have as they scale, as they go by 100 people or whatever, and just simply getting used to decisions being made, not by just walking by the CEO's desk. And at least get that out of the way before you add in the extra complexity of a London or a Dublin or Amsterdam office, 5, 6, 8, 9 time zones away. That's maybe one sort of simple thing, if that timing kind of works for your business. Specifically on org design, nearly every tech company is functionally organized, and many employees don't give that org structure very much thought because maybe every company they've ever worked for is functionally organized. But the thing about functional designs is they're built for efficiency within that function. They're not built for cross-functional decision-making. They've got one cross-functional GM, that's the CEO. And so the CEO has this extra power in every organization that any other GM doesn't necessarily have. When you go and you open an EMEA or an APAC organization for the first time, that's a cross-functional organization. It's got marketing, sales, maybe engineering, product, partnerships and so forth. And so there are problems associated with that. But personally, I like that. And I think typically you can kind of group functions, customer facing functions under that GM, whereas product and legal and that kind of thing would be separate.
Ramsey, what have you seen work and what did you experience? I know that this is something that you and I have talked about, and it's a very hot topic. I mean, I would say that with at least half of the speakers that I've been doing prep calls with, at some point or another, they've mentioned this very issue. So what have you seen? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think that most expansion comes off the back of sales. And so when you're going into a new region, revenue makes regions grow. And so the default, I think, and it was the case for me, was the first leader that you hire on the ground is a sales leader. And there's a pro and a con, of course, to that model. The pros of the function model, like Stephen mentioned, it's known to the business. So it's the default. It's how people know how decisions get made. Cost-wise, GMs are expensive, and it's a big bet. You may not be sure that the region is fully going to grow into what would justify a GM until it gets there. So there's a little bit of a smaller bet that you're making up front, and you want to you can sort of distribute the risk a bit. The leadership risk when you're functionally organized. If something's wrong with your sales, leader, your post-sales leader, something else, you're not sort of having to make a change for the entire region up front. So that's some of the pros. Some of the cons. As the regions grow, it may not be in anyone's job description who's in the region to look at the holistic health of the business. They may be focused on top line, but not paying attention to some of the things that are going to happen down the road. And those are hard to detect. And by the time you do detect them, you might have a problem on your hands. I think as offices grow, and a lot of times companies will plan for contingency if things don't go well, but they don't spend enough time thinking about what if things go well, faster than we expected. And suddenly we need to hire much more quickly. And if you just hire a functional leader, say a sales leader, to run the region, suddenly in addition to their AEs and their sales team that they're running, they might have a 30-person team where there's no redundancy in leadership. And you can get into a really difficult situation there just from things working out really, really well. What we learned along the way is that you're going to need, someone will become the de facto GM, and people in the office want a clear who's in charge around here. They want that question answered. So if you're going to go with the functional model, just have a plan in place for when the company or the local region reaches 15, 30, 50 people, well before you need that person.
Right. Tariq, Abe, I feel like these were really good answers. Do you have anything to add to this?
Not a lot. I mean, I'd say just on the early stage, one of the things that I've seen kind of effective on the organizational structure, I actually have seen like the US-based teams start to stimulate the international interest. So, for example, way back in the day when I was leading international at WebEx, we had a team that started to address Latin America from the United States, and they started to create enough interest then to springboard into the region. At Zoom, the whole international expansion started with a team affectionately known as ROW, Rest of World. So, as awkward as it was in some ways, it started to show interest, demand, creation of readiness, got the company a little bit minded around it before we were in. And then I'd say when people went in, I do think there's value in having organizationally somebody from the home office participating either in continent or in headquarters, just to help interpret and lend culture. I don't think they should lead it. I think that should be a national. However, ultimately, that national is going to need a little bit of acceleration themselves. And when you marry a headquarters-based person with a national, I think that adds a lot of value. So that's the only point I would add.
Just very quickly, 2 points. The first is, you can't have an international discussion without talking about matrix organizations. And so it's only a matter of time before that topic comes up. I think if you're going to do that, which everyone most likely has to do, whether it's a dotted or direct line or no line, you have to be really, really, really clear on your RACI, right? Like who's responsible for decision making, who decides, who informs, et cetera, et cetera. So those responsibilities up front and literally writing it down in a Word doc or in some capacity in a wiki is really important moving forward. Don't just assume it's implicitly understood. And then the second thing is you don't want to have an org structure where the people in a foreign office are the only people responsible for that foreign office. I think Abe maybe alluded to this, but the idea is like everyone, including your home office, should have an international global hat on, even if it's not their full-time job. And so while you might have people dedicated to Sweden or Mexico or Japan, you need to have people in the US who are actively thinking about it, and not just the executive leadership team, but everyone else as well.
Gotcha. So we were talking the other day, all of us, about whether anglophonic strategies are the right ones. I see a lot of that. Folks just think language. I mean, we've got a country here where it's a huge domestic population, two friendly neighbors that we don't really encounter much at the individual, like private citizen level very often, unless you live right next to one of the borders or you're in a huge metropolitan city and you have reason to, or you're just very international. But and then we've got these two large oceans. So there's this preference for, okay, they speak English there, let's just go there. It's easy to localize, stuff like that. But you guys have some sharp views about this. Stephen, once again, back to you, because I think you mentioned something interesting about Australia.
Yeah, well, I just think you need to be conscious about why you're choosing to go into a market. And going into it because it's easy is usually not a good enough reason. There may be other reasons. So Canada and the UK may well come up pretty high on a very logical prioritization list, just because of market size combined by ease of access. So you do have to weight market size by ease of access. Like China is famously difficult to break into. Japan is famously difficult to break into, even though they're enormous markets. There's a reason why you don't go there first. The UK is pretty easy and it's pretty big. It's always going to be near the top. I think, a country like Australia or New Zealand, or they're interesting ones because I think they sometimes lure American companies into selling into them before in a way that's not strategic. In that there are a lot of things that are very attractive about Australia. Similar type of cloud software usage, internet adoption to the US, for example, cultural links, all that kind of thing. But 25 million people, the economy is not in the top 10 in the world. Germany and France are like double and triple the size. So you've got to have a good reason for going to Australia before you're trying to tackle Germany, I would say is my bottom line.
Abe, what do you say? And how should folks think about like hub and spoke matters about stuff like this? What do you think?
Yeah, look, I agree with Stephen here. I think we're all kind of a like-minded group. Your APAC strategy is not built around Australia, nor is your continental European strategy built around just the UK. I do think it is a great place for most Silicon Valley companies to cut their teeth a little bit, and there is something to be said for the company again to keep the training wheels on a little bit while they're getting acclimated how to address a market and what that means. And we saw, we saw good success on that. I think the difference is to know when to take into the second or third gear. And that's where you really need somebody at the leadership level, either heading up international like the team here on this panel, or very, very strong international leader in one of the core markets to say, look, it's time to move into second and third gear, be it into India or into China or Japan in a APAC leveled strategy, or as Stephen was saying, in France or Germany. In our case, we were very slow initially to address the German market, like a lot of Silicon Valley companies. But when we knew it was time to move into second or third gear, we moved, and we got the company to understand the relevance and the importance, and we were able to do that. The good news is the experience in the UK helped them understand how to do it a little bit better and be ready to do it.
Abe and Ramsey, Tariq and Ramsey, any differing views?
I'll add two more points. The first is there's a theoretical framework is important, but we haven't talked about the realities of your current business in, for example, Australia, right? And so if you have a huge existing business, I'm talking more on the consumer non-revenue side, then there's arguments to be made there, even if it is potentially not a huge long-term value driver of the overall company. And the second thing is, like, don't assume that Anglophile countries are easy to expand into. Specifically, Australia is becoming harder and harder on the regulatory side, especially with regards to content rights. So just do a bit more due diligence, and perhaps Canada is a little easier, but Australia is definitely becoming harder and more challenging across the different areas. Language is one aspect, but language is not the only aspect, obviously.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think when I think about it, there's obviously what you can measure. There's the opportunity size, and you'll have a ranking based on that. There's also a matter of timing. So a market may look great to you, but they are not even ready for what you're ready to tell them about yet. And that happened to us, even though it would have looked like one of the first markets that we would have wanted to enter. We tapped on a little bit and found out it's going to take a year before they're ready to make purchasing decisions. And you'll find out that there are markets that may not seem super easy to enter, but they're really ready for the message or the product that you have. For us, India and China were both really ready for what we had. They're willing to take risks to try things out. Whereas a market like Europe, which would have seemed much more similar to the US, it just took a lot longer to warm people up to certain ideas and get them to test things.
Yes, this came up in our last session about what could go wrong and how to dodge it. Taking that testing and looking for signals and just kind of letting the market tell you, that was a big thing that they emphasized, that it was a point brought up by Honey and PayPal. So hiring, how do you pick the right people? And, this session is about sales, or at least the title is. But I think, you know, minding your revenue and making sure that you're on track and setting yourself up for success, that's everything that we've been covering. But how do you find a sales leader in divergent or just very different cultures where the style of selling may be different? You know, America's got a pretty specific sales style and culture here. How do you do the hiring, and how do you meet the culture where it is? Let's start with Ramsey.
I would say that hiring is the single most important thing that you're going to do that's going to impact whether you're going to succeed in a new market. And that, I think someone already said it, but that regional team that you hire is like its own company, especially when it's one of the first ones that you enter. So, you know, later down the road, we started indexing much towards functional skills, but early on, we would never hire someone that had never started a business themselves. So you want that entrepreneurial background. Of course, you want the sales or the functional experience that goes with it, but I think that was a really important component. You want people with a founder mentality and mindset. The best source of people is always your own network. And I think that that's where our best hires came from. And the nice thing about investors, and Stephen can speak to this, but you know, they have amazing networks all over the world. Your investors are a great source of people, entrepreneurs that might be looking for the next thing, that might want to take a country manager or first in country role. But I would definitely start there. Work best for us.
Abe, I'm sure you've been going through this a lot. What do you think? And by the way, if anybody's curious, you know, yes, I look very Neil before Zod at the moment, but this is the Golden Girls background coming to you live from their living room. Thank you for being a friend.
I like it. And thank you for using your background on Zoom. We like that. So
we're still having a camera issue, but this has never actually happened to us before, oddly. So I'm sorry to christen you guys with that issue, but
and I'm in an awful Wi-Fi place here, believe it or not, in Florida. Go and figure. So it's not even. I can't even say it's a really interestingly cool place to say I'm dialing in from. But
you're closer to the actual Golden Girls living room then.
I am. Yeah, I can only aspire at some point to have that myself. I guess the points. Look, network is key. You know, I think you want trusted people. I think part of it is also trust is extremely important. You know, Eric Yuan, our CEO and founder, talks a lot about speed of trust. In fact, it's a mandatory reading for us. And, you know, that's helpful. We've all been in a position to, you know, work with businesses and generally do this international work, which is great. And that could come from investors as well. Exactly as Ramsey said, you know, we've been really lucky to have some fantastic investors and collaborators in that regard. Getting the right recruiter to find talent is key as well. You know, when we were in places like Japan, you know, we knew the recruiters that we had to work with, and we have, and that's made a big difference. It does speed up the process, and it gets us to find the right kind of talent quickly. Somebody said it before, is talking about like the GM versus VP of sales type role. Whoever is the leader, people will look to somebody. So the character of the strength of that first or second key person is critical. And I think part of what we're also learning is that first hire is not necessarily going to be able to be the scale hire forever. And that there might be a time and a place where they take on different functions in the company or in the office, and that's great. But there might be a time to then add that more seasoned, for lack of a better term, or senior person, and that's okay too.
You know, another thing that I'm curious about on this, I'm glad this came up, is the style of the company and what it is that they're doing, right? So there's a company I will not name that hired a bunch of Uber people, but their business model is nothing like the city launcher model. And if you've met those kinds of folks, these are like the folks that you could drop into the middle of Mongolia and they'd figure out how to organize the society and bounce out. That is not necessarily who's selling entertainment, right? But the lore of Uber, and this is a well-funded company doing amazing things. We were reading about them. How do you find the right person, right? Like there are just so many styles of expansion and varieties of products. Like, how do you make sure that fit is right? Even if that person, and you know, I have a follow-up question to that. We'll start with you, Tariq.
I think, look, if you don't have an existing network in that geo, or you don't have, or you don't know that geo, so let's assume this is the first time you're doing this in a brand new role at a small company. There are a ton of local recruiting agencies that will help you if you pay money for it, right? And I would obviously vet them and figure out, I'm speaking very tactically speaking here, but it might be worth it to spend a little bit of money to find the right level of talent. The second point is like, don't take a ton of risk. I think Abe alluded to this with the first few hires, because that sets the tone for the rest of at least the next 2 or 3 years. You could eventually take risks later on down the road, but probably not upfront. And to your other point, Julian, that you brought up around city launchers and things like that, like it's important that to think of them as still employees as your domestic company, right? And so to be relevant and similar skill set, at least, even if the knowledge base is different, but the skill set of a salesperson in Germany should be relatively same as a skill set as a salesperson in the US, for example. And so use that as a barometer to see, would you hire that person in the US if they were a city launcher in the US, for example. There are some minor exceptions, I will admit to that. So Japan is a totally different market from a skill set point of view, and other places like that. But for the most part, I think that holds true.
Stephen, what do you think? Finding the right person for the right kind of service or product that you're,
Yeah, only
and one thing to tack on to the end of that question is, do you, if you've seen a head of international expansion do it right in the beginning at one job versus like they go in after the die were cast and they manage growth from there, but we're not part of the entry, like 2 different experiences of the same thing, how does that factor in?
Yeah, well, a couple of practical points maybe. I've been surprised at how many companies expand internationally without the CEO personally visiting the first office location and spending just a little bit of time there. And by time, I mean, a week or 3 or 4 days. It's kind of surprising, but in the world of self-serve and SaaS and just, selling software in general, it feels like you can do everything remotely. And of course you can technically, but the thing that you can't easily do is sort of replicate the talent networks that you have close to headquarters. And so the simple task of going and visiting the city and spending a week there and making it your business to meet 10 good potential candidates 3 or 6 months before you actually launch starts the process of kind of building your own talent network. And you can kind of use that to get to people. I mean, having a local kind of a Sherpa, whether that is an investor, whether it's, a previous executive who's been successful in the region, whatever it is, that's important. A number of the guys have mentioned that already. And then the final thing, Abe actually mentioned this earlier on, I just sort of bring it up again, is that notion of a landing team where you send over probably like a pretty tenured, it doesn't have to be senior, but tenured, well thought of employee from headquarters. For cultural reasons, they can be a really good way to mitigate your risk of hiring a senior person who has the skills, but who you're not sure about culturally. 8 time zones away, things can go very wrong by the time you really realize it. Whereas if you have a trusted person from HQ over there, just to kind of complement that a little bit, and that can mitigate the risk a little bit. So I love the landing team model. It is not as popular as you would think. I would estimate only about 10% of companies are willing to give up the scarce resource from headquarters. I think it always pays back.
Yeah, and I guess the other part of the question that I'm hoping to explore a little bit, and then we can move on, is is there a Gryffindor hat or or the hat in Harry Potter where it says Gryffindor or Ravenclaw or whatever, that like, is there a type of person for the kind of companies? Like obviously SaaS is its own beast. Anyway, we can layer that into the response from you, Ramsey. What do you think about these questions around picking the right guy, gal in markets that you're going into, and the style of personality versus the product that you're selling, or whatever?
Yeah, I think there's so much pressure on that role. that it's important. They have to be, and I guess to the question about landing parties, sometimes companies will bring in people to run the operations from US or from a different region. I think it's critical you have someone that's native and local. But it's also really important that person is at least bicultural, because it's important. It's as important that they understand the market as they understand your culture and where you're coming from. So when we would find someone to run China or Europe, previous experience living, working in Silicon Valley, knowing that the culture that exists here is, almost as important, or else the two pieces don't come together. So, I think the Gryffindor thing for me is the prior entrepreneurial experience, because I think that's ultimately, what they're going to be doing and up to. But that bicultural thing is super, super important. And it's not just language. It's really understanding, there's a lot of maxims and things that we live by in Silicon Valley, things like embracing failure and transparency and those things. Even though you might give everyone the same book to read, getting that entire team or office really operating that way takes someone who really knows it. So again, whether you bring that person, to from the seasoned cultural ambassador over, which we did, and Stephen, sounds like you've found good success in that too. We brought a sales ops person from the US to Europe, and then put that person in APAC. And it was the perfect person to put in both places, and helped out so tremendously. And that's a function, frankly, that can be anywhere, right? I think those are really good best practices.
Cool. So we've got some other topics that I promised this audience that we'd hit. So I'm going to move it along. Unless, Abe, do you have a quick comment on that? Party. Okay, cool. So sales forecasting, revenue goals, and sales management. How do you plan that by region? How should folks think about their percentage of global sales, along the way, versus their domestic market? Ramsey, that was a question from you. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm interested in knowing Stephen's answer, because I know he did quite a bit of surveying here. I believe that if the product that you're taking to the world is equally applicable everywhere, then it's going to be, roughly, equally distributed over the course of time across North America, EMEA, and APAC. I've seen companies that have the majority of their revenue US companies coming from APAC really early. I've seen companies that have 40+% coming from Europe. So, whether it's 30, 40, 30, who has the majority, may change over time. But I do feel like in the fullness of time, it'll be pretty balanced. Of course, the average deal sizes and that sort of thing may be different. But I think, Stephen, I'd love to know your answer, and Abe and you, Tariq, too, to see what you guys have seen.
Yeah, Stephen, you brought up that research that you guys did.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't think we specifically touched on how people do their sales forecasting, but just thinking back to my time as an operator at Twitter, and I was setting up the European business there. Twitter back in 2011 didn't really have a stated goal for Europe. So, I had to try and figure out what was the right number. And there's kind of a bottoms up approach you can take and a top down, at least pretty simplistically. This was before we had sales ops and we had, a lot of more quantitative people. The bottoms up approach, you can kind of look at, salesperson productivity in the US, and you can apply some discount factors to like the UK and whatever, Germany, France, and do it that way. I think in the end, that could be a little bit pseudoscientific, and you end up magnifying errors by multiplying them by big numbers. In the end, honestly, I think the best approach is you go top down and you say, right, okay, I know Europe better than APAC. For SaaS, like 30% of your revenue ultimately should be coming from Europe at the point of IPO. That might be 5 years down the line. Like, honestly, work backwards. Where should you be at the end of your first year? Where are you now? You're going to be at 30% in 5 years' time. Like, draw a line and say, okay, let's get to 10% by the end of this year, and then just start getting some data points. But, a sales finance or sales ops person would probably hate to hear me say that. But, that's what I thought was the most sort of back of the envelope, simple way to do it.
Abe, how are you guys thinking about this?
Before we went public, the year before we went public, we were about 20% of revenue was coming from APAC and EMEA. And when we started to look in best in class, whether it was Salesforce, ServiceNow, et cetera, that were high growth enterprise software as a service, they were trending right around 30 to 35 to 36% at scale. So, our last quarter in Q4 of our fiscal year that just ended, we were at about 33% of revenue coming from APAC and EMEA combined. And they're fairly material numbers now. So, we're notching on a pure B2B enterprise SaaS level at about 36% is where we're pacing, 35, 36%, like the pack, if you will. Stephen, you've experienced that more consumer-like play with a Twitter or a Google, where we look at numbers, it's more than 50% coming from outside the US. So, it depends on if it's more of a B2B play or a B2C play. And then just on the rigor around like our revenue and how we manage our revenue organization, in that regard, we're culturally agnostic. We keep the teams very consistent on how our metrics are, what the measurements are. As we get the formula right, that formula tends to work globally. And we expect the forecast and how we look at the rigor of the business to be consistent. We can't, that's where I think we got it. And we were getting into trouble is if we try to deviate and create a separate model over here and a separate model over there and a separate model over there. That's where you start to confuse your friends at headquarters, and they don't invite you to the party anymore. And then you're sitting in the Golden Girls living room. So that's how it works.
Womp womp.
I had to do it.
Well deserved. Tariq, what do you think?
I think on the peer benchmarking point that Stephen and Abe brought up, Reddit is specific in that we're sort of the last private company among our peers, and so it's really easy to look at Google and Facebook and others and see what percent of the revenue comes from outside the US, right? Like Facebook is 60, Google's 55, Twitter is 40, Snap is 40, and so, but then there's a big drop. Pinterest is like 15, 20. But the one call out I'll make is sources of revenue. A gap is not necessarily gap being from an accounting point of view is not necessarily revenue from a management point of view. And specifically, what I mean by that is, at least for a consumer company, the revenue from a user eyeballs versus revenue from a buyer versus revenue from a seller location, are all three different things, are not captured in your GAAP accounting. And so keep that in mind as you're thinking about the ROI of a consumer product bet that's not necessarily captured in your quote unquote international revenue, because international revenue is almost always, according to GAAP at least, based on your buyer billing location, right? And then the last point I'll make on the productivity, the bottoms up approach is just a very tactical thing, is ask your interviewees, right? Just do some market research into, ask them, the candidates that you're interviewing for sales jobs, tell me about your productivity or your last few jobs, and have 5 or 6 or 7 different benchmarks to come to an average. I know it's, again, this is pseudoscience, but it's better than nothing, as opposed to just saying, giving a 20% haircut to a US productivity number.
So I'm glad we're talking about haircuts. I need one now that the vaccine is in sight. But the issue around pricing and discounts, being an India specialist myself, I see a lot of companies really spend a lot of time on this topic. I know that was a big issue for LinkedIn in the beginning with them out there. How have you seen that yourselves in the markets that you go into, and what is it that you need to work out, or is that even important? Ramsey.
I think this is, at least the way that we frankly approached it was, we saw for momentum in the early stages. So we're really going after big logos and willing to discount heavily. And then over time, you start selling into your potential wherever it is. And we saw all of our regional teams, what they thought was the high watermark, exceed that a year later. So they have to come up their own confidence and being willing to ask for the big number, no matter what market it is. So it takes a while to know really where those boundaries are, region by region. Of course they exist. But I would say, the way we approached it was let's get momentum first, and then optimize for revenue as we go, and then just keep pushing the, whatever your metric, your ARPU, or your your average deal size by whatever your denominator is. Just keep pushing the boundaries of that, because salespeople, as they get more confident, will get more and more, especially more experienced sellers, and they can often find that high water mark fast.
Anyone else have special views on pricing and discounts? Because there's something I want to ask you. Retention, support. I think that everyone's looking at the like sell the deal, or at least a lot of folks that I see and hear from. What about service and retention? I mean, and support. Like, what are some of the territories where that's been the most challenging, and how have you fixed that? What do you think, Stephen? I mean, you've seen that with a lot of companies that you've invested in, and how did that work out with Twitter? Have there been models that have changed, or resources that have made all of that easier?
Well, one, I suppose, kind of genre of problem is a more technical sale that in headquarters is actually not driven just by the sales team. There may be, some engineering involvement, for example, some, after sales support involvement, that kind of thing. And then when you go to a new region and you spin up a sales team, but you don't have an engineering team there, or it's, particularly hard to hire sales engineers. I have seen, those kind of more technical sales cause companies to struggle in the early days, simply because they hadn't fully mapped out what their real go-to-market motion was, that it had more inputs from more functions than they thought. So, I mean, that's one sort of recent example, and it comes up with quite a few of the companies that we help.
What do you think, Ramsey? Service retention.
I would say, I guess what I would add to that is being prepared. Like I said, one of the things that we found when we went into certain parts of APAC is sales went much faster, and we closed literally twice as many deals per quarter than we did in another region. And so you're playing a really nasty game of catch up on the post-sales side. To hire, you're 6 to 9 months from having the resource that you want on the ground from the time you start. So just kind of having that extra bandwidth. But I think it also comes back to that question of GM versus sales leader. If your first person on the ground is a sales leader, they're maybe not thinking about the renewal that's going to come up before you're ready for it. If you have a GM or you're thinking ahead, at least give that leader some retention or net retention metrics to think about, just so that it's not just putting things in the top of the funnel, only to find that it's leaky.
Mm-hmm. Abe, how have you guys been handling this?
It's hard. I mean, it's a hard question. I think, first of all, there's a mindset. And the good news is, I think at Zoom, what I've experienced at Zoom is, from Eric Yuan, again, our founder, all the way down, everybody is in customer success. So the feeling, it doesn't matter what office you are in, whether it's a single licensed user or 100,000 licensed user, you better be prepared to immediately respond and support the customer, because our biggest cultural values around delivering happiness, ensuring that the client reaches their potential. So I think there's a philosophy that has to be endemic in the office to begin with, globally. As we think about entrance too, we've talked a lot today about leading with the sales leader. We're trying to lead at least with a pod, so that the pod includes people that are SEs, they are, channel account managers, they have a customer success manager. So some semblance of a group that creates that first core. And then, as the business starts to expand, we've got to make sure that the ratios are consistently aligned, and that the functional requirements for technical support, billing support, customer success, as Stephen said, technical account managers or professional services, that has to be commensurate. And, that, I think that comes with maturity of now moving from, you could say, jack of all trades type roles, where people are a bit more entrepreneurial and willing to do that, to more functional roles that have scale. So that's been our experience.
And Tariq?
Nothing to add. We could, yeah, I think everyone's spot on it. I think, making sure that the customer support model is even greater in international markets, at least up front, is so over indexing and trying to overcorrect, I think is going to be really, really important, because everything will break double or triple the amount of time in these markets as in the US or in your HQ.
Okay,
One
so
additional point, it's worth thinking through at the start, sort of fast forwarding in your mind and thinking, what are the functions that we're going to have in place 3 years down the line? Because the city that you choose, if it's London, right, you'll have all the functions available. If you choose another place, like an Amsterdam or a Dublin, it may be particularly strong in certain functions and a little less strong because they're just smaller cities and other functions. Worth thinking about that too, because sometimes people optimize for the function that you're leading with, be it sales, for example, and then they're disappointed that they're in the wrong city to build an engineering team 3 years later.
That is coming up in a later session with the UK. If you had a moment to convey like either something that we did not ask but you wish I had, or the advice that you would give someone who is saying, hey, we're doing great, international expansion, we're already in a few markets and we're getting really serious about this. If you give them 45 seconds, 60 seconds, that's all you had to give them, what would it be? Abe, take it away.
Be deliberate, either go or don't go. Don't go in the middle. So you're either in or you're out, and the market expects it, and there's no going back once you start. So in or out. It's a Yoda statement.
Ramsey?
Yeah, it's along the same lines. I think you gotta know what the cost or what it really takes to be a global company before you start, and really get that buy-in from the CEO on down that we're ready to do this.
Tariq?
I think it's important to know the bad models of expansion. There's a line company, I won't say the company, but it was basically like, well, they were asked which countries will we go into next, and they said, well, we're going to be in all of them soon anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And I think the logic, and then like they ended up retreating from a lot of countries. So I think the logic there is just know the risks a lot more than the rewards, because I think the rewards are really obvious, but the risks are not necessarily obvious.
And Stephen, closing advice?
Yeah, one non-obvious learning for me was something that I call success amnesia, which is that a successful company in the US is 5 or 6 years old before it goes international. And by the time it expands, it kind of has forgotten all of the dirty cross-functional work that it had to do in the first 2 or 3 years back home to make it really successful. And it can think that international expansion is just about sales, and it's never just about sales. And so overinvestment in things like whether it's BD or marketing or whatever it is required to seed a successful sales effort in a new market.
There are a bunch of topics that I really wish we could have gotten into that I know that folks want to know about. So maybe we can do a rehash of this with my camera working better next time, focusing on how COVID changed the business, geopolitical factors that could affect sales and what you're watching and how to understand it and prepare for it. There's just so much in this topic. We get so many questions about it. And I'm just delighted that Ramsey was able to help and collaborate with me on this and invite you gents on. This is absolutely wonderful. I really appreciate this.
Thanks, Julian, and thanks to the rest of the panelists. I thought this was awesome. I'd love to continue this over a few beers, but it'll probably be, we got some work to do globally before that can happen.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks again, guys. I am...